Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is Sunday, June 15th, 2025, and I'm kind of nerding out on some just prehistory stuff, just ancient history. I watched this video today. If you guys want to check out a good channel for biblical text research, Associates for Biblical Research was on here, and there's this other channel I had talked about, Let Us Reason. Apparently he was hosting this guy, so it's on both channels. One is comments turned off, one is comments turned on, so I've been remarking on this. And the reason I'm reviewing this stuff is because these guys are standing under the Septuagint or LXX chronology as the better chronology for ancient history. I'm rejecting that. I'm going with the Masoretic text, and when I hear people giving rationale for the LXX, I want to listen, because obviously I could be wrong, but I want to hear their evidence and their facts why. One of these things these guys are going to go through, and this guy Let Us Reason, I quit following his channel because he's just frustrating. He's just obtuse. He doesn't really listen to criticisms of the Pre-Trib rapture or the doctrine of imminence or pretty much anything he believes. And he seems motivated to debunk the idea of 7,000 years of human history, because he thinks anything that can remotely lead to a prediction about when the second coming of Christ is, like even within 100 years or anything like that, he thinks is wrong. He thinks that upsets the doctrine of imminence, and so he's motivated to debunk anything that could lead to predictions. Well, the 7,000 year human history thing is really old. We know it's in the Mishnah, and I think it's the Seder Olam. It's this whole idea of being 2,000 years of tohu avohu, or formless and void, which basically means lawlessness or confusion, followed by 2,000 years of the law, which is Abraham to Messiah, followed by 2,000 years of, they call the days of Messiah, followed by 1,000 years of peace. And so this is all built on Moses saying a day is as 1,000 years, and they look at it in their history, and apparently this idea comes from Jews who are like, well, hey, there's 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham, approximately, not exactly, but approximately. And then, so they suspect there's going to be another 2,000 years from Abraham to Messiah. And of course, you have Hosea 6 that says there's going to be 2 days until he returns. And so you have 2,000 years of Messiah followed by this 1,000 years of peace. So these are Jews who don't believe Christ is the Messiah who is saying this. And what these guys are saying is these guys changed the Masoretic text to put Christ outside of the period of when the Messiah could come. The problem is it puts Christ exactly when the Messiah comes. If you look at, again, Bishop Usher did this, 300-400 years ago. He marks it down to 4,000 years BC using the Masoretic text chronology. So these guys are assuming things like they've got a bad judgment for the Masoretic text chronology, but Bishop Usher's chronology has been around for 400 years. It's very well attested to. It's very well known. Happened during the days of Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. Okay? So the fact that these guys don't address this at all, and they say, they go based on the Jewish calendars, and they say, based on the Jewish calendar's version of the Masoretic text, this puts Christ out of the chronology. Well, it doesn't matter. We've got the Masoretic text in all of our English Bibles right now, and we can do the math ourselves, and we can actually bring it to, I've done the math myself, and I brought it to 4008 BC from Adam to Christ, or to the year 0, I should say. Okay, so it's roughly 4,004 years from the birth of Christ to Adam, and Bishop Usher gets exactly 4,000 years. So I'm off from Bishop Usher's calculation by 4 years. And he doesn't just use the Bible, he uses the Bible and all the known available ancient histories of his day, okay, to come up with that calculation. So the fact that these guys are ignoring this is one big fat strike against them. Another big fat strike against them is they don't bring up the fact that the Septuagint, the oldest references we have to the Septuagint, we know it to have been created during the days of Ptolemy II, about a decade after Manetho's Egyptica. That's really important to know, that there's a standard Egyptian historical chronology that's been published 10 years before the Septuagint comes out. Because if they're trying to make their stuff credible with the scholarship of their days, they might try to match that up. So there's some incentive for them to change that. Well, you guys have heard me cover this in the past, but I'm just going to read this again. I'm just going to show you. This is going in my Serpent by the Way book. When you look at, these guys are going to heavily weight their defense of the LXX on the Samaritan Pentateuch. Well, when you read the Samaritan Pentateuch and you read the lines where you're going to, you see right here it says, and our facts had lived 5 and 30 and 100 years. This is how they write it, okay? That looks weird, 5 and 30 and 100 years. Especially, you might say that doesn't look weird on its face, but it does look weird when you go look at this is Genesis 11, but in Genesis 5, it's going to say it differently. It's going to say 231 years. It's not going to say 1 in 30 and 200 years, okay? Or it might say 201 and 30 years, okay? So they're not saying, and you can just look this up right now, watch. You can go to this step, and you can read the Samaritan Pentateuch in English, okay? Now here's their English translation, and it says, the book of the generations of Adam, it says, Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness. Okay, so notice how it just says 130 years. Seth lived 105 years, so notice how it's just saying 105 years, okay? This is the direct translation of their Septuagint that is using basically Hebrew Aramaic script, okay? But when you get to Genesis 11, you're going to see these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. That's what the Masoretic said. And Shem lived after he begot Arphaxad 500 years and begot sons and daughters. And the days of Shem were 600 years and dying. Notice how it's just saying 600, 500, right? Then it says Arphaxad lived after he begot Salah 303 years. Notice how it just says 303. It doesn't say 3 and 300, okay? But it says, and Arphaxad lived 5 and 30 and 100 years and begot Salah. Why is it saying 600 years here? Why is it saying why is it saying 303 years here, but then it's saying 8 and 30 and 4 years between? Because that's the ones they're changing. See, this is simple. If you just use a little bit of logic, that's what they're changing, okay? So if you go here, if I want to change this, and this is what the LXX does, from, you see 800 years and he lived 930 years, and it says Seth lived 135 years and begot Enosh, okay? Well, all I'm doing is taking a 1 and changing the word to a 2. That doesn't change the scroll much. I'm just taking a 1 and translating it to 2. Now, I don't know what the Hebrew for 1 and 2 is. 3 letters and 4 letters, and the 4th one's a yod. So you could see you could fit that change in there without changing the lines of the scroll hardly at all, because you're just changing a 1 from a 2. But when they're over here, for some reason they're adding it after the fact. Well, why are they adding it after the fact? Probably because they're adding it at the end of a line. That would be my guess. So it says, and the days of Adam after he begotten his Seth were 800 years. So notice it's saying 800, 930 years, 500 years, 107 years, 912 years. They're all saying it that way, okay? But when you get to chapter 11, you're going to see it interspersed. You're going to see these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after. He lived 500 years, 600 years. And then it's the lines that are different from the Masoretic that are 5 and 30 and 100 years. Is that a coincidence? They keep going back and forth. And Arphaxad lived 5 and 30 and 100 years and begot Salah. And Arphaxad lived after begot Salah 303 years and begot sons and daughters. And the sons of Arphaxad were 8 and 30 years and 400 years. And he is dying. Okay? And Salah begot 31 and 100 years and begot Eber. And Salah lived after he begot Eber 303 years. So why can they just say 303 years, but in the lines that are changing to be away from what the Masoretic says, it says 30 years and 100 years and blah, blah, blah. It's because you're adding and 100 years over and over and over again. You're just adding the line, and you're not changing the whole text to say 330 years, you're just interspersing the Septuagint. Now, these guys are going to argue and they're going to make the case. And again, when I hear people making a bad case, this just firms me up in my case all the more, okay? They're not looking at this. They keep referencing the Samaritan Pentateuch, and they keep referencing how, the Samaritan Pentateuch matches the LXX. And we know the Samaritans were isolated and they wouldn't have had anything to do with the Greeks in the LXX. Well, why? Why would you say that? Because the Samaritans are isolated today. It's 2,000 years later. Were they isolated back then? Well, they're isolated from the Jews in the time of Christ. But were they isolated from all the other people in the region in the time the Septuagint was written? The answer is no. In fact, if you go to your Josephus, you're going to find stuff about Sanballat. And Sanballat is the guy who builds the temple of the temple at Mount Gerizim that the Samaritans use. Well, this guy, he's hobnobbing with Alexander the Great. He's hobnobbing with Darius before him. Are you trying to tell me they were isolated? No. They are all over. He's talking with Greeks and he's talking with Persians. So to act like, they're just this isolated community and they wouldn't have cared what the Greeks were writing, yes, they would have. Do you know who gave Sanballat the permission to build the temple on Mount Gerizim? Alexander the Great. And Ptolemy is one of his generals, and his successor, Ptolemy II, is the one who's building the library in Alexandria. So this is literally the guy who is contemporary, and then he's going to make his son the first priest of the temple, and his son is during the days of Ptolemy II, when they're making the Septuagint. So we know these guys are interacting with the Greeks and the Persians during this time. We know the Jews are mixing ideas with the Greeks and the Persians in this time, and lo and behold, we have a chronology in Manetho that seems to match the Septuagint. If you add those extra, I think it's like 14 or 1500 years. Okay? Well, I'm going to show you guys evidence that I'm going to show you quite a bit of evidence that the Masoretic timeline is better. And when we get into my Serpent by the Way book, there's going to be tons and tons and tons of evidence of it. But I'm going to show you some major pieces of evidence that these guys need to interact with, and they're not. Okay? So for starters, you want to look this up on Wikipedia. Remember when the Masoretic text is going to have the flood. It's going to be in the mid 24th century. It's going to be roughly 2350 BC. It's going to be like 2346 or something like that, okay? In the mid 24th century anomaly, this is something that has been figured out, I don't know, radiologically, I guess. There's this disaster that occurs 2354 and 2345, okay? Between this is the window where it happens. So it's a 9-year window. 2345 is the closest it can happen. That's the year after the flood in Masoretic text. Now pay attention to what it says. In the mid-24th century, in this period of consistently reduced annual temperatures that are reconstructed from a constructive abnormally narrow Irish oak tree rings, these tree rings are of a period of catastrophically reduced growth in the Irish trees during that period. This range of dates also matches the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. This is when they're saying the transition from the Neolithic, aka Caveman Age, to the Bronze Age is recorded in world history, okay? In the British Isles, in the period of widespread societal collapse in the Near East, what happened? All these societies in the Near East, this is archaeology and geology and all this stuff, collapsed around 2345. That's the year after the flood. Okay? It has been proposed that this anomalous downturn in climate might have been the result of comet debris suspended through the atmosphere. Well, if the Earth is surrounded by an ice bubble and you throw a comet at it, guess what that's going to create? You're going to have a uniformly temperatured Earth suddenly broken. And the temperatures from outer space are going to affect it. And what you're going to end up with is an Earth with a climate like it is right now, where it's cold at the top and bottom, but your immediate effects are going to be a huge ice age. Okay? So you don't just have Noah's flood happening, you also have an ice age starting. And you're going to have a ice age after the flood, and that's going to be part of the reason that the flood waters recede. Now check this out. It has been proposed that this anomalous downturn in the climate might have been the result of comet debris suspended in the atmosphere. In 1997, Maria Agnes Cordy proposed that the natural disaster involving wildfires, floods, and an air blast of over 100 megatons. Okay? So a nuclear level air blast occurred in 2350 BCE, okay? This estimate they have is 5 years before the flood. The proposal is based on unusual dust deposits that have been reported from archaeological sites in Mesopotamia and a few hundred kilometers from each other. In later papers, Cordy subsequently revised the date of this event from 2350 to 2000 BCE, okay? So they're changing it to 2000 BC, but the evidence was 2350. Based on the analysis of satellite imagery, and Bini Lake in southern Iraq has been suggested as a possible extraterrestrial impact crater and the possible cause of a natural disaster. So if God opening up the window of heavens is throwing an asteroid through the ice bubble, what's that going to do? Well, this ice is going to collapse. See, the waters above, which are ice, is going to collapse. And it's not just going to come down as huge ice, it's going to melt through the atmosphere and come down as rain. The windows of heaven were open and it started pouring rain, okay? Now he says, the more recent sources have argued for a formation of a lake through the subsistence of underlying basement fault rocks. Bailey and McKinney's discussion of this climate anomaly discusses the abnormally narrow iris tree rings and anomalous dust. So they're using tree rings and dust and the same methods they would use to date geological ages and stuff to say something happened with a huge wind gust, and they think it might be a meteor that landed somewhere in Mesopotamia, which would make sense because that's right in the heart of where everyone was screwing up. And God probably threw a meteor right at Eden, so they'd never find it again. Okay? Now check this out. Guess what else happened at the same time? We have 4.2 kill a year event. This is they have this around 2200 BC. They say this was one of the most severe climatic events in the Holocene epoch. It defines the beginning of the current Megalayan age in the Holocene research. 2200 to the entire 2200 BC has been hypothesized to have caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire didn't exist yet. The Langzhou Empire in the lower Yangtze River, and or the Langzhou culture, so that would be pre-flood Chinese culture if there are people there. And the drought may have initiated the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, which I told you is pre-flood as well. Of its population moving southeast followed the movement of their desired habitat, as well as the migration of the Indo-European people of India. Sometimes scientists disagree with that conclusion, citing evidence that the event was not a global drought and it did not happen during the climate timeline. So this is like 100 years before. Well, the Atrahasis, which is the Sumerian version of Noah's flood, has this guy whose name is Ziusudra. Just so Ziusudra, if you were to translate that into a Proto-Indo-European, is Zeus, water, god of water. Okay, that's what Ziusudra means. Okay, it seems to me to be the base of, so the god Indra is a storm god, and Indra, it means Lord of the poor, Lord of the downpour. Okay. Or Lord, it's basically rains and stuff, okay? So Lord of the poor, and Zeus is the storm god, okay? Well, Ziusudra means means god of water, okay? So it seems like Zeus went to the west, and that was the shortened form, and Udra went to the east, and they added in, which is the word for Lord in Proto-Indo-European or Sanskrit, and he becomes Indra. The Hindu, and I think he's also worshipped in Avestan, so pre-Zoroastrian storm god. Indra and Zeus are the same person, okay? But the original was Ziusudra. So anyways, Ziusudra seems to also be Zarathustra, because Ziusudra is their Noah, and Zarathustra happens to be a guy who's after these 10 generations of kings that end with a guy dividing his 3 sons. So he's a prophet, but he's roughly contemporary with the days of Noah. Okay, this is in their legends and stuff like this, and then of course these are in the Gathas written. They don't really have his date laid down because he's a legendary figure and he wrote the Gathas. He is recorded as a guy who's a son of this guy, son of this guy, son of this guy, but his name seems to be based on Ziusudra. Okay. So anyways, what the Atrahasis says is that there was a great famine before the flood. And what this is saying is there's evidence of probably great famines and stuff like this that would have caused all these civilizations to collapse before the flood. Now, I don't think that happens because I think the Bible would have just told us that. But what I do know is that this is when the Great Flood is recorded by China. And it was saved by semi-divine interventions by a goddess named Nuwa. Nuwa, okay? This is what the Chinese say. When? 2300 BCE. So that's within 50 years of the biblical Masoretic flood date, okay? But what I know even more importantly than that is this megaton blast, this 100 megaton blast that goes on is recorded in the Bible. Because if you go to Genesis chapter 8, he says, God remembered Noah and every living thing and the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind passed over the earth and the waters assuaged. If the waters that covered the entire earth are pushed away by a wind, not just draining into the earth, that's probably part of the process. Some of it evaporated, some of it drained into the earth, into the chasms and stuff in the earth where it could go. But the main force that the Bible talks about making the waters go away is a great wind. He's making a wind pass over the earth. Well, he does the same thing in the days of Moses. That's how he parts the Red Sea, is with a wind. And what happens? It heaps up the water like a wall on either side. So he's just making a wind pass over the earth like this, and it's pushing the waters north and south. That's where your ice age comes from. So what you end up doing is pushing all these waters north and south, where it's suddenly a lot colder. This is so important. It's a lot colder because the windows of heaven have been broken. So the windows of heaven are opened, or the ice bubble is broken, and so in the north and south it's a lot colder. Near the equator, where you're getting the most sunlight, it's still warm. But in the north and the south, it gets a lot colder. And if he's heaping up the waters there, what they're going to heap up to, think about this. If it's ice caps now, any water you pile on top of that just makes higher and higher and higher ice caps. Well, how glacier ice melts is because of the pressure from the weight of the snow above it. Pressure and heat go hand in hand. And so if you increase the pressure, if you decrease the pressure, it's going to get cold, which is why if you go into high elevation places where the oxygen is less pressurized, it's just colder. Okay, it's not high. This is why high elevations are cold. But if you go under the pressure of all this snow on you, no matter how cold it is, the pressure is going to cause that snow to melt. And so what happens is that snow was probably huge ice walls back in the day. And this is what we have evidence of. We have big woolly mammoths and stuff like that frozen in these huge ice walls and stuff like that. And then it's going to slowly melt into all the rivers and lakes and glacial decrease and stuff like that, where we have evidence of all over Siberia, North America, and stuff like that. Okay? Why? Because God made a wind pass over the earth. That wind is recorded, surprise, 2354. This is literally the decade surrounding the flood in the Masoretic text. So we have archaeological evidence of it right there. Doesn't work with the LXX, but it works right there. If this doesn't work with the LXX, you have to explain the sudden catastrophe that brings all these civilizations to a collapse around the time of the flood. And you literally have this everywhere. Okay? Now we're going to go into Egyptology, and we're going to show you the same thing. When you see the name Amen, Amenemhat, okay? This literally means Ammon or Ham is the head. So Ham is the head, the first. What is the biblical name for Egypt? I'll give you a hint. Do a Bible word search on the word Ham. The original biblical name for Egypt. It is called Misraim, because Misraim is Ham's son. But they call it, he smote the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength, in the tabernacles of Ham. Okay? So you have Mitzrayim, Ham. Okay? Now the Egyptians are going to have a city where the Ogdoad is worshipped. Notice this is C-H-A-M, Cham. It's a guttural Ham. And it's called Chemet. Chemet, okay? There's Ham. So Chemet is probably a name of a city that came from the Hebrews, because Cham, Hebrews don't have a K. They have a guttural CH, and then they have, which is, this would be their letter K. So it's actually K-H-A-M or K-H-E-M. So Ham, or Ham, is where Hemet comes from. And it's probably when the Israelites were in Egypt that it was named that. Okay? Because the Egyptian name for Ham is Ammon. Okay? So you see, they have Ham dwelt there of old. Okay? So we know Hamites are dwelling in Canaan. We know that the land of Ham is a word. You're going to find it in the Psalms. This is in the days of David. They're going to call Egypt the land of Ham over and over and over again. Well, surprise, this is the first dynasty after the flood. And the dynasties, the first pharaoh after the flood's name is Ham is the head. Is that a coincidence? Probably not. Ham's still alive when this is happening. So it's called Ham is the head. So they're subject to Ham, and he's the king of Egypt, and this is probably Mizraim right here. That would be my guess, or one of Mizraim's sons. But if you look at these kings lists, and I'm looking at the Turin's kings list, the Manetho's kings list, the different kings lists that we have, one of the ways I'm studying this in the Sumerians kings list and all these other kings lists, and it should be obvious to your historians, but it apparently is not, is what gods are they worshiping? And you can tell what gods they're worshiping based on the names of the pharaohs and kings, because their names always mean like protected by this guy, or blessed by this guy, or the beloved of this guy, and it's always a god. Okay? Well, if you go to the pre-flood era, and you can trace these dynasties, they go all the way back to around 3100 BCE, which is around the time of the death of Adam. Okay? That's how far they go back. Which makes a lot of sense, because before that, they would be under the dominion of Adam. But after Adam dies, they split up and they start warring. Okay? And you find that you have all these pharaohs right up into the time. Remember, the whole earth was filled with violence right before the flood. Okay? So notice these dates. We've got 1700. This is the time after this. Okay? But we're going to go all the way back to the time of Adam. These are unknown people, so they were there. This is about 100 years before the death of Adam. Okay? So these are people, they're probably settling it from way back. They're settling, we know probably the main places they settled is just like after the flood. It's going to be Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley civilization, and Egypt. Okay? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 14 famous people. Maybe they're kings, maybe they're whatever. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're all successive kings listed to around the time that Adam dies. Adam dies, it's like 3070 BCE, okay? So you have 13 kings or rulers or whatever they are. It doesn't say that they're all successive rulers. They could just be kings that are listed. Then we're going to have, after Adam dies, we have these people, and they're noted by, there's the scorpion king, they're noted by these animals, okay? Well, why are they known by these animals? Could be the time when they're starting to make Nephilim. Because this is also around the time, no, I'm sorry, that's 225 BCE. So these are people, are apparent, this is Upper Egypt, and this is Lower Egypt. And they're not united yet. Well, then you have the, these are also people right before Adam dies. Then you have what's considered the first dynasty of Egypt when it's united. And this is Narmer, okay, who they believe is Menes. Why? Because it's probably a version of Mizraim. But this is 3150 BCE. This is just before Adam dies. This is when Egypt is supposedly united for the first time. Well, who's this guy who's uniting them? Well, he's a lot bigger than everyone else. He might be a Nephilim. This is literally what they have in their stuff, okay? And now we're in around the time that Adam dies. Now, notice all their names are Hor-Aha, okay? We have this guy named Horus, this eagle god in the sky, who starts appearing around this time, okay? Who are these other guys? We don't know. They're just named after animals and stuff like that. But we don't have any clear gods showing up. And then you see 2900 BCE. This is around... not long after the death of Adam, it's actually within about 100 years of the death of Adam, you have Horus show up as a clear god. Horus is a bird. Well, what happens around 100 years after the death of Adam? I'll tell you what happens around 100 years after the death of Adam. Enoch gets translated. Maybe this guy who's associated with this bird god is because he's based on this guy who got raptured up into the sky. Because this Horus is based on a falcon, which is a raptor. Maybe that's it. I'll have to double check my math, but I believe Enoch was 350 when he gets raptured, and he's born, I think he's the 7th from Adam, so he would have been born 7 times 3, 7, roughly 750 years, and then it's about 100 years after Adam that Enoch gets translated. So right around the time that Enoch gets translated, they start worshiping this bird god named Horus. Now you have a guy named Hor, and I think that's probably just their name for falcon. Athotis, boy, that sounds like that's where Thoth comes from. May also be Menes, although Narmer is more likely. Trade was largely replaced by exploitation in his region. You know what my guess would be? That's probably Enoch. That's probably Enoch. And then after that, Enoch gets translated, and Horus is all of a sudden attached to, you see this god show up, okay? Before that, the only other deified person we find show up is a guy named Set, or Seth, okay? Which is who? Adam's firstborn, who would have died also about 100 years after Adam. So you go and you find these other guys, Nijetur, Ba, Weneg. Notice they have a bunch of different names. Wadnijes, Budnefer, Sennijes. You don't see a bunch of people appearing, but here you go. Here's the first appearance of Seth. Seth Pirbensin. Well, what does Seth Pirbensin mean? Okay. Seth Pirbensin is a royal name, and it means something like house heart there. The heart of Seth is satisfied. So if Seth dies about 100-ish years after Adam, actually we can probably get pretty specific on this. We have Seth dying. Adam is going to live till he's 930 years old. He's going to bear Seth at 130 years old. So just take off 800 years from Adam, and then that's when Seth is born. And then Seth is going to live to be 912 years. 912 years minus 800, or I'm sorry, minus 100 or plus 130 is going to put you at 1,030 years. Okay, so 1,030 years is going to be roughly 2830 BCE. Okay. So let's see when Seth starts showing up as a god in the Egyptians. 2740 BCE. 90 years after Seth dies, surprise, the heart of Seth is satisfied becomes a king's name. Is that shocking? No. Is it shocking that Horus starts to be worshipped after Enoch gets raptured? No. That actually makes a lot of sense. Okay? So let's keep going. We see Neferkara. Let's see what Neferkara means. Maybe this is a god too. Ka, we know, is the Egyptian word for the Holy Spirit, basically. Beautiful life force. See, Ka Ra, the sun god Ra. So Ra, remember, is their version of Utu. It's just the word for the sun to the Sumerians and the Egyptians. And you got to remember, these are just symbols. And so the word that we're going to have for them is going to be their post-Tower of Babel word for it. We're not going to have what they said in the old day. So it's just the sun symbol is the version of Yahweh in Sumer, and it's the version of Yahweh in Egypt. And these are pre-flood, okay? So you see, beautiful Ka Ra. Beautiful Ka Ra. Well, what's that? Well, that's their version of the Lord and the Spirit. Remember, they have temple inscriptions that say Ra sent the flood, okay? So beautiful is the Ka of Ra. That's what Neferkara means, okay? So if we look at these Egyptian records, remember, those would have been their OG gods, like Enlil. They don't seem to have a version of Enlil, which is like a high father god and then a sun god. They just have the sun god and the Lord, which is the Lord and the Spirit, basically. Which would have been an alternative way if somebody has the eyewitness account of whatever happened in Genesis, 1 through 4 or whatever. You don't actually see the Father. He's in the third person account that Moses gets, which makes sense, but he doesn't seem to be in the he doesn't seem to be appearing. Whereas you have the Spirit and you have the Lord making themselves known to the people. Okay? So you have Ka and Ra, which is their version of the Lord and the Spirit, just like you have Utu and what becomes Ninlil. Okay? But Enlil and Ninlil, I believe, are post-flood inventions. I don't believe that they were what they called them. I believe that there was a version Lord of the Spirit and Lady of the Spirit, but I believe their version of the Holy Spirit and the Father basically is coined. The terminology is coined after the flood. Okay? But when you see Neferkarasar, okay, so when we see Ka Ra, that's the Spirit and the Lord, okay? Then you see Horus there. So now you're seeing Enoch starting to get worshipped alongside Ka and Ra and Seth. Okay, why? Because they've all just died. Or he's been translated and he's just died in the past 50 years, okay? So it's after that, and then there's Horus again. And what they end up with, if you keep going down, because they have a whole bunch of different names, but you don't see a long history of a god being listed. But you remember, they descend into violence. And so notice, we're looking for 2350 BC. There's the flood. As we're getting closer to the flood, watch the century before the flood. You have this guy Teti, Uzarakar, Marikar, Marinair, Neferkari. So there's Ka and Ra again. Okay, beautiful is Ka Ra. There's a name that's there. Men Enra, there's Ra again, or Mer Enra. Nedakara, whenever you see the Ra at the end, that's Ra, the sun god, so that's their version of Utu, and you see Ra at the end of a lot of stuff, okay? So they're mostly worshiping the Lord, the Son of Righteousness, okay? But then we're going to get into the years right before, that does cross the years before the flood. It's 2330. Because remember, they believe Ra sent the flood. So this is right after the flood. Notice you see Ra, 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 Ra at the end of these names. Why? They believe Ra's the one who sent the flood. The Son of Righteousness sent the flood. Okay? There's Ra here right before the flood, 2375. But there was somebody else that I was looking for. After the flood, so you see Ra all over the place up until the flood. Ra's right there, Ra's right there, Ra's right there. Ra's associated with their names, which is their version of the Son of Righteousness. Okay? And then you see this guy Intef, the elder, Tepia, Sewerkat. Who are these guys? We don't know. We don't know who these guys are. Could they be local jurisdiction people? They could be, but check this out. Then we get to Amenemhat. 1991 to 1962 BC. Amenemhat means Amen is head. Okay? Ham is head. Do you know when Ham would have died if he was around the same age as Shem? Around, so if the flood is in 2350 and they're about 100 years old when they get there, 1850, that's when Ham would have died. So 100 years before the death of Ham, you have a guy ruling Egypt whose name means Ham is the head. That's what his name means. Ham is the head. That works perfectly with the Masoretic text. Ham is the head. And surprise, this is the 12th dynasty, okay? Now, what they would say is back here is the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, okay? They would say that the Old Kingdom ended, surprise, around the time of the flood. Is that shocking? And what you have in between this is a disunified Egypt, is what they believe, okay? So remember, the whole world turned to violence before the flood, so we have a disunified Egypt around the time of the fall of the United Egypt, which is when the whole world descends into violence. And the god that they're worshiping before Amen is head, and it's probably not, he's not even deified yet. He's still living. Amen is the head, means he's the head of the Egyptians. Because he lives in Canaan at this time. Now he's going to go eventually to Pakistan, and he's going to die there, but remember, this is a guy who lives 500 years after the flood, okay? And at this time, he's still living in Canaan. And he's eventually going to go colonize Pakistan with Canaan's sons. And guess where his name is? Himalayas. Literally means the domain of Ham. It's the Vedic version, and because there's this guy named Hamavet, which is a god that was worshipped by the Hindus before the Vedic Aryans got there. And Hamuvat means domain of Ham. And so Hamalias is just their name for domain of Ham. And they think Ham, because in Aryan, Ham is the word for snow, so they think it means domain of snow. But you have Ham buried in Pakistan up at the top of the Hindu Kush, which just literally means river of Kush. Kashmir means mountains of Kush, or mountains of Kash, and then you have the Kashite people inhabiting Babylon. And you basically have Ham and two grandsons of Kush, at least, go colonize Pakistan up to the Himalayas, and it means the domain of Ham. Okay? And so you have, surprise, surprise, look for Ammon before this time. You won't find Ammon before this time. Do you know why? Because this is around the time, this is about 200 years after the flood. So they're just establishing this kingdom for the first time. And all these guys here, obscure pharaoh absent from later list, tomb unknown, these are these other, we have records of these guys. These are probably pre-flood guys, but they're not part of a united kingdom. Do we know if they're kings? We don't know. But what we do know is that Egypt was ruled by these guys that are just like Ensis. They're called nomes. So nomes are basically mayors. They're city mayors. Sumerians have Ensis, which are basically, they seem to be like priest kings. And Egyptians have nomes. And if somebody unifies all the nomes underneath them, which would have happened after Adam dies, that's why you have Narmer unifying all of Egypt underneath him, just like you have these Lugals trying to unify Mesopotamia underneath them after Adam dies. You have people trying to take over and claim dominion after Adam dies. Surprise, surprise. And so after all this happens and after the flood, they're going to go all the way back to Ham is the head, the first. That's what his name means. But the god who's before that, Mentuhotep, Mentu is a war god. And you're going to find, notice he's Mentuhotep the fourth. All these guys are based on this Mentu guy who's a war god. So in the time that God says it was filled with violence, they're worshiping a war god. They go from worshiping Ra, the son of righteousness, to worshiping a war god, just like the Sumerians go from following Utu, the son of righteousness, to worshiping the war god. His name is Ningirsu, because Ningirsu is the one who justifies the Lugals going to war over Gu Eden, or the border of Eden. So you see the whole world descending into violence. People go from worshiping the god of creation, who they believe is associated with the sun, because he comes down in the cool of evening and he glows brighter than the sun. Okay? And then they go from that to worshiping a war god. Well, when they're worshiping the war god, one of the things they do to justify all this war is they start talking about these tablets of destiny. And the tablets of destiny are basically saying it's fated and written in the heavens that I'm supposed to rule and take over you guys, and that's why we're going to war. So the tablets of destiny are, surprise, fatalism. So what do we have going on today? All these people who are warring, seditious people, and I mean your Calvinists, your Muslims, what do? They all believe in fate. They believe everything is destined. And so that's what justifies them overthrowing governments and going to war and try to take over stuff. Is it surprising that Calvinism is increasing as America is becoming more and more militant? Shouldn't be at all. They believe it's the fate. God wills it. This is why the Franks were running around yelling, God wills it during the Crusades. They're following Augustinianism. God wills for us to dominate you. Yeah, that's a really old saying. It's the tablets of destiny, the heavenly tablets, fate. It's God's sovereignty, God's sovereign will. It's just different ways of saying the same thing. God wants me to overthrow you. That's what's going down now. Why? Because I'm better. Because I was chosen. I'm elect. But you have all this evidence again. If Ammon is Ham, and everything is 1,000 years older, then we should find Ammon 1,000 years before this, because he's really famous. But when we go back and we look through tomb inscriptions, his name is Ra-Atum. Utu, the sun god, and Adam. They're merging Adam with the sun god. Ra-Atum. This is what year is this? Um, 2345 BCE, right around the year of the flood. You have a guy. This Egyptian coffin text is dated to 2100 BC. So Ham would still be alive, presumably around this time. Because this is going to be roughly 250 years after the flood. Okay? So presumably he'd still be alive, probably for 100 or so years. And in this funerary text, he says, this is a speech by the sun god Ra. Remember, this is Utu. Hail and peace, I repeat to you the good deeds which my own heart did for me from within the serpent coil, because they believe that the earth is under the dominion of Satan. And so within the serpent coil, this is the thing that you're going to find going all the way to Sumer, or to Mesoamerica. When they're playing the ball game, they're trying to throw the ball through a serpent. And they still have a thing in the jungles of Venezuela. I think you have to jump over the serpent to get into eternal life. Well, Ra is the one who can help you do that. So within the serpent coil, in order to silence the strife, I made 4 winds that every man might breathe in his time. So they're talking about the shortening of life. That's what happens during the flood. I made the great inundation, the great flood, that the humble might benefit it like by the great. Because remember, the great flood does give them rest in the earth. It makes the whole earth greener and able to be, the seasons actually naturally till the earth. That's what's going on. So it makes it easier to cultivate the earth because the seasons, the snow and the leaves falling are basically fertilizing it. Everything's getting easier. Okay? I made every man like his fellow. I did not command that they do wrong. It is their hearts that disobey what I have said. I have created the gods from my sweat and the people from the tears of my eye. So again, they're getting pagan, but they're still worshiping basically the God of the Old Testament. He says, I shall sail in my bark. I am Lord of eternity, crossing the sky. I am not afraid of my limbs, for who in Hike overthrow. This is the king responding, okay? Who in Hike overthrow for me that evil being, okay? So who in Hike, is the evil being that's supposed to be overthrown is going to be Apophis, which is the serpent, okay? I shall see light land. I shall dwell in it. Make away with me, that I may see Noon and Ammon, Noah and Ham. For I am that Ak that passes by the guards. And I think Ak means like spirit or soul. I am equipped and effective in its opening portal. As for this person who knows this spell, he will be like Ra in the eastern sky, like Osiris in the netherworld. He will go down in the circle of fire without flame touching him ever. So what is he saying? Osiris seems to be based on Abel. Ra is obviously based on the Son of Righteousness. And he's saying they're going to help him get through the ring of fire, or as you might call it, the serpent coil. You're trying to get through your soul through the ring of fire. And that's what these guys playing this ball game. They're throwing the ball through the serpent hole. And then the guys who lose die. They kill them at the end. Sometimes it depends on who you read, but sometimes they'll say that the winners die at the end because their souls get through, okay? And the idea is if they win the game, their souls are going to get through the serpent coil, and that's how they're going to get into eternal life. So they kill them. Isn't that great? But when is this happening? Again, you see Ra, you see Ammon, you see Noah. When do you see Noon is Noah and Ammon is Ham? When do you see these things? Well, this is dated... this one is dated Dismantled Coffee 1919 to 1800. So Noah would have died 300 years after the flood. So he would have died around 1950. Ham would have died somewhere around, if he lived to be the same age as Shem, let's say he's around 600. 600 years after the flood is going to put him at 1850. So here's a coffin dated within 50 to 100 years of Ham and Shem dying, based on the Masoretic text. This doesn't work with the LXX, but it works with the Masoretic perfectly. So 50 to 100 years after Ham and Shem die, you have this thing that mentions him trying to get to Noon and Ammon. Ham and Noah dying. Noah and Ham. Why? Because they're dead now. You're trying to get to where they are, where the good people go. That's what he believes, okay? So I don't think these chronological dates are so cray-cray. I know there's a lot of people that really try to mess with them because a lot of this stuff says that the pyramids were built before the flood and whatnot. I'm not going to weigh in on whether or not the pyramids are built before the flood. These guys have pretty good arguments that they weren't. They're saying the flood would have totally destroyed them, but it would have just knocked them over and people could have rebuilt them after the flood. So I don't entirely buy that. The fact that there's three great pyramids and then 3 minor pyramids, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth seem to be famous throughout the world. What the 3 great pyramids and the 3 minor pyramids seem to be, this is just my estimation, they seem to be reincarnation chambers. That's the belief. And they seem to be, when you had the limestone and everything, the sun would shine on it in such a way to look like you're beaming up and down through the sun. And it makes sense if you got 3 big ones and 3 small ones, because you have the 3 great gods and their wives. And it seems like you have in the Chinese, you have the 3 sovereigns. These guys know who Shem, Ham, and Japheth are, because you're going to have Nu and Naunet. And then you're going to have the 3 people of the Ogdoad, which is basically Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. So you have the Sphinx, who some people believe is based on the first king of Egypt, which would have been Mizraim. And then you have these 3 other great people, and then these other great people. Now, we know whose tomb that was last, of the pharaohs last, but we don't know that different pharaohs weren't using it and changing the inscriptions to match themselves over the years and remodeling these things to basically make it look like they're the reincarnation of the last guy, because reincarnation came from Egypt. All we know is what we've dug up. But that doesn't mean that that's the original form of that thing. So they could have built these things before the flood and then made them after the flood. They could have rebuilt them. Even if the floodwaters knocked them all over, well, you've got inscriptions of these things carved into stone, so you know what they look like somewhere. You just go rebuild them. Their bases are still going to be there. Their stones might be knocked over, but it's not too hard to be like, oh, there's this big, huge structure, and then all these stones in the ground next to it. I wonder what happened after the flood. They could have just rebuilt it. So I'm not going to weigh in on that one way or the other. I'm going to let the archaeology decide. But what I am going to weigh in on stuff where you literally see these lists where these god names start appearing. So if my belief is that Horus is based on Enoch, because Enoch gets raptured up and you have a falcon in Egypt. They don't have eagles in Egypt, but they have falcons out there, and that would be your raptor bird. So it makes sense this guy gets raptured, that you have a raptor representing him. It also makes sense that Seth, who's the firstborn of Adam, who the righteous priesthood comes from, and he's basically the head, he establishes the first priest in the West among the Sethites. Well, the people of Egypt would have been descended from the Sethites. And the people of the Indus Valley civilization would have been descended from the Canaanites. So it makes sense that they'd be worshiping the same people. And then when these guys are going to dig this stuff up and they're going to have new languages after the Tower of Babel, what we're hearing, Ra and Utu, is really just the son of righteousness, the son of justice. It's the same guy. But they're just, their words changed, and now it's Ra and Ka, and you find that the Sinaites carry Ra and Ka all the way over to China as Ri and Ki, or Ri and Chi. Okay? They're the same thing. They're their version, so Chi, or the Force, okay, is their version of the Holy Spirit. It's a corruption. I'm not saying that's the true thing, but it's what they called it, which started from the original Lord and the Spirit of the Lord. So the Son of Righteousness and the Spirit of God are seen as a brother and sister, or they are seen as a husband and wife. Why? Well, because you have the Father in heaven, and you have these two coming down, and if you read Proverbs, it says that I work beside the Lord in the creation. This is the wisdom saying this. Well, who are you working beside him? Are you his husband? Are you his wife? Are you his brother? Are you his sister? Eternal. We're eternal. So there's always this relationship, but the relationship is akin to a mother, father, and a child. But their point is they're two spiritual beings who are united and working side by side in the creation. They're cooperative. So, moral of the story. The Septuagint chronology, I believe, sucks. I believe it's corrupted to match Manetho. I believe Manetho is corrupted, not as bad as you think corrupted. It's just that when you go back to Manetho beyond this stuff, and this stuff is basically establishing Egyptology, what these guys don't admit, the Christian guys don't admit, is that some of this Egyptian stuff is pre-flood. Not all of it, but some of it is pre-flood. And you do have a gap of hundreds of years while they're rebuilding civilization after the flood. It's just that it's not accounted because guys like Manetho tried to fill it in, just like the Sumerians' kings list tried to fill it in, because they're both out to convince people that their kings are descended from the gods, and they've had this one line of unified rule all the way down through the ages, because they're writing this in the days where the Greeks conquered everything. And so if you want to maintain the pedigree of your nobility and their lands and their claims on different property and different dominions and administrations and rule, well, you want to show that there was this long rule going back to ancient times, and if you offend that, you offend the gods. Because these people are descended from the gods, and the Greeks believed heavily in that stuff. And so these guys were fudging the details a little bit to make it look like these guys were descending from the gods. And also, by this time, the Pythagoreans among the Greeks don't believe in the ancient flood anymore. They're spreading it around in Plato's day, and Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. And so because they don't believe in the ancient flood, or one big ancient flood that destroyed the whole world, they're open to admitting these ideas that are in the Sumerians' kings list and the Turians' kings list of there being a flood, but it's somewhere way before their civilization started. Because what these guys aren't saying is that there was a flood and we dug Egypt back up and we rebuilt on its foundations. What they're trying to say is this was an unbroken line of legitimate succession going all the way back to before the flood. And they can't do that if they say we destroyed it with a flood and dug it up later, because who's the legitimate line of succession then? There isn't one. Okay? You miss connecting your people to the gods if you take, okay, and then there was a flood and everyone was killed and these different people came and repopulated this afterwards. See, because then there's only one line of succession anyone cares about, and that's Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Who's descended from them, and who's the firstborn, and who's whatnot. And if you have Alexander the Great saying, well, hey, I'm a descendant of the Japhethites, and I'm ruling everything. These other Hamites in the Semites in Babylon and the Hamites in Egypt, their rule is mud. So they want their rule to be legitimized. And they don't know Shem, Ham, and Japheth anymore. These are just one of their pantheon of gods because they've been merging this stuff with various gods related to various ancestors for many, many centuries. And they forgot their OGs were Nun and Ammon, Noah and Ham. And Menes is Mizraim. So that's what you got going on. But I do want to say something really cool that I found in the Septuagint today. Daniel 5, or Daniel 9:25 in the LXX, says this. It promotes the gap theory. If you go to Daniel 9:25 and you look at it in the Septuagint, he says, 70 weeks will be determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city for sin to be ended, and to seal up transgression, and to blot out iniquities, and to make atonement for iniquities, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision of the prophet, and anoint the most holy. Now, if you look at the copies of Daniel that they have at the time the church takes over, they're much worse than this. So whoever did this did a pretty good job. That's very close to the Masoretic, but check this out. He says, and thou shalt know and understand that from the going forth of the command for the answer and for the building of Jerusalem, which is Nehemiah 2, until Christ the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 69 weeks of times, okay? These sevens, and it's going to take you to 33 AD. And then he says, and then the time shall return. The time shall return, and the street shall be built, and the wall, and the time shall be exhausted. Do you see how different that is? They're saying there's going to be 69 weeks, and then the time will return, and the street shall be rebuilt, and the wall, and the times will be exhausted. That sounds like modern Jerusalem. That sounds like Daniel's 70th week. And after 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be destroyed, and there is no judgment in him, and he shall destroy the city and sanctuary with the prince that is coming, and they shall be cut off with a flood, and the end of the war, which is rapidly completed, shall appoint the city to desolations, and 1 week shall establish the covenant with many in the midst of the week. My sacrifice and drink offering shall be taken away, and on the temple shall be the abomination of desolations, and the end of time shall be put there in the desolation. So notice there's 2 different desolations. There's the city being put to desolations in 70 AD, And then there's the temple and the abomination of desolation in that last week. So notice that it appoints 7 and 62 weeks, and then the time shall return. So there's a gap, and then we're going to get back to the 70 weeks thing. And then you're going to have this thing, and after that, you're going to have the 70 weeks, and the end of time will be put to desolation. That's exactly what Hippolytus of Rome said. That's a pretty good translation. It's not the best. The point is I'm not against I'm not against Septuagint translations. There are translations that are used by them in the Old Testament, and some of their translations are clearer, at least, than the Hebrew. There's other ones I found where the Masoretic is clearer than the Septuagint, which is clearly quoted in the New Testament. If you get the Masoretic, the passage makes a lot more sense, like the end of Romans 9. So we'll get into that when I get to New Testament stuff, but I want to make that point that, and I think this other guy, he agrees with me. I think both these guys, they agree that nobody is saying that all of the Septuagint translation is better than the Masoretic or vice versa. Nobody is trying to say that. Remember, you're talking about ideas that were translated, some of these things from Hebrew idioms into Greek, and in a lot of cases that is going to be a lot more clearer to translate into English into words that we understand, because the Greek is a lot more technical and plain, and Hebrew idioms are not always the easiest to discern. Okay? So in a lot of cases in the New Testament usages, the Septuagint is either fine or actually better than the Masoretic. And I think these guys would agree sometimes the Masoretic is better too. Okay? So we're all in agreement on that. Where we are in disagreement, and I think these guys are heavily loaded with bias based on the pre-trib rapture and the doctrine of imminence, is that they look at people getting into the 7,000 year history, which I promote, and I promote the 2 days until the second coming of Christ thing from Hosea chapter 6. I think those are clear indications, along with several others that I pointed out, that about 2,000 years after Christ's leaving, he will return. Well, these guys don't like those theories because they believe the doctrine of imminence says Christ could have returned in the days of the apostles. No, he couldn't have, and the apostles never say that. The apostles never insinuate that Christ is going to be back in their own day. That's why James, when he writes James, is going to tell them to be patient because the Lord is going to, he's going to wait till he gets the former and the latter rain and all the fruit. Okay? So if you see here, he's talking about them. He says, take heed be patient, establish or steady your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draws near. It draws near. That doesn't mean it's at hand. It's drawing near. Okay? But he says, be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waits for the precious for the earth, and has long patience for it until he receives the early and the latter rain. Does that sound like they're expecting Christ to come right away? Well, no. And look, the early and the latter rain points to Hosea 6. See, people long before me understood this. We shall know if we go on to follow the Lord. Let's see. After 2 days he will revive us, and Thursday we'll live in his sight. And we shall know if we follow the Lord, that his going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come to us as the rain, as the former and the latter rain. So there you go. He's prepared as the morning. He's the Son of Righteousness, rising with healing is in his wings. And then he comes as in the Holy Spirit in the former rain, and then the Holy Spirit in the latter rain, and then he returns, and they're going to live in his sight. After 2 days, 2,000 years. This is where the two days, they call it the days of Messiah, this is where this comes from. This is where the Jews get this. They just missed it with Christ. So he's saying be patient for this. Be patient for what? 2,000 years. 2,000 years. And because we're approaching 2033, we're getting very close to it. People are always trying to predict, and this is why this guy is against this. He actually says it right in the beginning of the video. And I would recommend you guys watch this. This is Associates for Bible Research, and then the other one is Let Us Reason, okay? He says right in the beginning, because these people believe in a pre-trib rapture, and 2,000 years puts them, they think the end of Daniel's 70th week is the return of Christ in 2033. They think the rapture is going to happen between this year and next, because of their stupid doctrine of imminence. If you don't have a doctrine of imminence, all you have is signs to watch for. You have Christ is going to return after the abomination of desolation. It's that simple. So there's no temple rebuilt. It's not going to be today. If they're rebuilding the temple, it might be this year. If they're finished rebuilding the temple, it might be this month. If a guy goes and sits in the temple, claims to be God, it might be today. In fact, it probably is today. But we don't look for anything prior to the abomination of desolation. Because these guys believe in the doctrine of imminence, their people have to speculate about when it is from Daniel's 70th week, and they're trying to track back 7 years back from Daniel's 70th week. That's dumb. We don't do that. Christ told us to look for signs, not to count days. He says, you won't know the day or the hour, but look for these things. When you see these things, look up. Your redemption draws near. Luke said that, and Paul made abundantly clear what is our redemption. This is in Romans chapter 8, when he says, your redemption draws near. He says, for the creature is made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption at the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation groans and travails together to now, and not only they, but we also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, we ourselves groan, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. It's the resurrection of the dead, which happens at the rapture. That's the redemption. So when he says, look up, your redemption draws near, that's another way of saying the resurrection of the dead or the rapture. The redemption of our body. Notice it says he points to Ephesians 1:4, which is the earnest of our inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession. What is that? Christ purchased us with his blood. He's going to redeem us at the rapture in our gathering together unto him. The redemption is the rapture. So when he says, look up, notice it points right here, the redemption of our body, boom, Luke 21. And Luke was Paul's scribe, so he knew Paul's writings. And he says, and when these things shall begin to come to pass, look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. When they begin to come to pass. When they begin, what? Woe to them who give suck, for there will be great distress in this people. What do we see? When you see Jerusalem encompassed by armies, then you know the desolation thereof is near. Is Jerusalem getting encompassed by armies now? It's heading there. It's not there right now. We're not going to claim now look up, but it's heading there. It's picking fights with everybody. Okay? They're shooting Iran. They're taking out Hezbollah. They're taking out the Gaza Strip. They're fighting everybody, and they're winning. Okay? Then let them in Judea flee to the mountains. So when it's encompassed by armies, it's growing near, okay? But this ultimate encompassing by armies is actually going to be what leads to the Battle of Armageddon, okay? This is not going to be Gog and Magog 1. It's going to be the Battle of Armageddon. And then it's going to have the abomination of desolation is going to be what kicks off them fleeing into the mountains. This is all explained in Matthew 24. So these guys, I would love to, if somebody can communicate with these guys to say, hey, you guys, look at this evidence this guy's pulling together. Can you answer this stuff? Okay? Can you answer Hammon and Noam? Have you looked into the Ogdoad? Have you looked into the Sumerians and the idea that the Sinites and the Zemarites went and colonized Canaan? Because this is what I believe. Canaan, the son of Arphaxad, is probably Canaan, the son-in-law of Arphaxad, because Canaan in the book of Jubilees is documented as digging up the clay tablets and reviving the mysteries. So if you go to the book of Jubilees, and again, this is Second Temple literature written around 160 BCE, so this is based on what the Jews commonly believe. Well, we already know that they commonly believe that the Tower of Babel happened in the days of Peleg by Nimrod, okay? That doesn't work, though. Because the days of Peleg, he's third generation, and the days of Nimrod, well, he's fourth generation from Cush. So how are you going to put the Tower of Babel and the whole world being two clumped together in one place when you're only in third generation people? You're trying to tell me it's just me, my kids, and my grandkids, and God was like, what are you doing? Scatter throughout the whole earth. There's 12 of you now. There's 70 of them. There's 70 people. Why is he going to tell 70 people to scatter on the earth and not help each other? He's not going to do that at that time. By the time you get to Hammurabi's Tower of Marduk, you have between 10 and 50,000 people living in Babylon. That's a small city by today's standard. That's a small town. But back then, that was the biggest city in the earth. And that's in the days of Joseph. The armies and the people were much smaller back then, okay? But we want to look at this Canaan guy. Now, according to the book of Jubilees, Canaan was cursed because he settled in Shem's territory. That might be true, or it might be because they revived the Nephilim before Noah died. Because by the time you get to Abraham in the Promised Land, Noah should have been still alive, I think. 1975, he would have died, let's see, 350. No, he would have just died. And by the time Abraham enters in the promised land, you have Amraphel wiping out tribes of Nephilim, which means the Canaanites brought back the Nephilim while Noah was still alive. They revived all the mystery religions, and they do all that while Noah's still alive. That makes it sound like that's why Noah cursed them. Okay? So, if you get into the genealogy of Noah and his sons, this is the chapter, and it's page 70 in this book, but I think it's chapter 8 in the book of Jubilees. It says, in the 29th Jubilee, 1373 after Adam. This is how it jacked up the book of Jubilees. It's saying just 1,300 years after Adam. The flood is 300 years too early. Doesn't work with any of the chronologies. In the first week, in the beginning thereof, Arphaxad took to himself a wife. Her name was Razuajah, of the daughter of Susan, the daughter of Elam, and she bare unto him a child and called his name Canaan. This is where Canaan from the Septuagint comes from. And even though this was written after the Septuagint, I believe that these records, whatever they are older than the Septuagint, wherever it comes from. I believe these were mixed with Babylonian records. That's where they came from. Because there's stuff in here, and this whole dividing of the land between Noah and three sons seems to be from Zoroastrianism, not from Judaism. There's nothing in Judaism to a point that Noah divided the world between Shem, Ham, and Japheth. There's nothing in the Bible to suggest that, or to suggest that anyone's in territory that they shouldn't be in. With the exception of the Canaanites, who God is wiping out because of their wickedness, not because they're in territory that doesn't belong to them. So if God is telling Abraham he is going to give the territory of the Canaanites to him, but he's not going to do it yet because the sins of the Amorites are not yet full, that doesn't make sense if the Canaanites weren't supposed to be in that land. The Bible just says that's where they were, and then from there they spread abroad. It didn't say that they invaded land that wasn't there. So I was going to put that in my book, and the more I'm reading and studying the Bible, I'm like, God would have said if they weren't supposed to be there. But he says specifically, I'm not going to kick them out of the land because their sin is not full yet. And then when their sin becomes full, he says the land therefore vomiteth them out. So by the time they've peaked out their wickedness, then they're getting kicked out of the land. But anyways, he said, so this is Canaan. He said the son grew and his father taught him writing, and he went to seek for himself a place where he might seize for himself the city. So how would Arphaxad teach him writing? How would Arphaxad teach Canaan writing? The answer, he wouldn't. Why would he know? This is Shem's son. If they're not getting into the Babylonian mysteries, there's another person who's getting into the Babylonian mysteries, and that is Canaan, the son of Ham. Well, we know they're getting into the Babylonian mysteries, or the antediluvian mysteries, because they're making Nephilim. And the Sign is being worshipped in Ur of the Chaldees as God. So he says he grew and taught himself writing, and he went to seek a place where he might find a city, and he found writing in which former generations had carved in the rock, and he read what was thereon, and he transcribed it in sin owing to it, for it contained the teaching of the watchers in accordance with which they used to watch the omens and the sun and the moon and the stars of heaven. What is he saying? He's saying this guy found Sumerian. He found Sumer. And he found the stuff that was written from before the flood, and he wrote it down, and that's where astrology came back to the world. This is probably not Canaan, it's probably Canaan. Now think about this. It says he has a son with this person named Canaan, okay? Well, this is all made up history. But if you go all the way back to Genesis 11, is it that strange to consider the possibility, or Genesis 10, I'm sorry, that when Noah has Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham has 4 sons, and the youngest one is Canaan, that Canaan might marry a daughter of Arphaxad, the oldest of Shem? That the 4th son of Canaan might marry a daughter of Arphaxad, the oldest son of Shem. That's not unheard of at all, which would make him then the son-in-law of Arphaxad. And we know the Bible does this because we can go to Genesis 36 and we can see where Jobab is counted as the son of Zerah, and Zerah is the son of Ruel, Esau's son. So that's his grandson. So he's counted as the son of Zerah, because after he's over 100 years old, he's going to marry Zerah's daughter. So he's going to marry a granddaughter of Esau. But remember, he's roughly the same age as Esau, but he's from a generation that lives to be much older. So Esau is going to die probably around between 140, 150 like Jacob. And Job is going to live to be like 248. And so he's going to marry Zerah's daughter, which is Esau's great-granddaughter, and he's going to have a bunch more kids with her, because his first wife had 10 kids, and she's barren now, okay? So we see that he's counted as a son, even though he's his son-in-law. And when we get to Zerubbabel and guys like this, now this could have been a Levirate thing. It also could be a son-in-law. Because if we go to Chronicles, chapter 3, where you're going to have the sons of David, we see the sons of Jeconiah, okay? Notice he doesn't say he begot him, it just says his sons of him, okay? So he says the sons of Jeconiah, Asher, Salathiel, his son, Malchiram also, and Pedaiah, and Shemanazar, and Jechemiah, and Nebiah, and the sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei. So he's saying that now, when we get into the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, we're going to have Salathiel being the father of Zerubbabel. Well, how is that possible? Simple. It could be son-in-law. That's how. So Salathiel, his son, the son of Jeconiah, could have a son-in-law named Zerubbabel. And that breaks the curse of Jeconiah. Because if he's got Jeconiah, none of his sons can sit on the throne ever again. But Zerubbabel is not his son by birth, it's his son-in-law. Could be Levirate, or it could be his son-in-law, because look at Pedaiah would be a if Salathiel is the son, Malchiram, Pedaiah, and Pedaiah is Zerubbabel, one of these guys could be a son-in-law, and then that could be a son-in-law of a son-in-law, or married back into the family. Or it could be a Levirate thing. But the point is, it's just counted as a son, even though it's not his genetic son. And if you just go see Salathiel and you see he's the son of Pedaiah here, well, in Matthew, he says, Zerubbabel is the son of Salathiel, not Pedaiah. Okay? If you go to Luke chapter 3, also says we have two witnesses that say Zerubbabel is the son of Salathiel, not Pedaiah. Well, how could that be? Simple. Son-in-law. He could be a son-in-law, but his real father is Pedaiah. Okay? But then it has Salathiel not being the son of Jeconiah, but he has Salathiel being the son of Melchi. Simple. He could be a son-in-law. If Jeconiah doesn't have any more sons and he just has sons-in-law, or if the kingship is passed down through a son-in-law and it's not passed down, or in other words, the royal line that leads to Christ is passed down through a son-in-law, well, that could be his son-in-law, and it goes back to Salathiel all the way back to Nathan, which is Solomon's older brother. See? So the point is, when you call somebody their son, doesn't necessarily mean they were born to him a son, but Jubilees is going to make up all these names, and I think this could be based on the Canaan dynasty of the Zoroastrians, and they're making this up because what they do, the Zoroastrians are descended from the Magi, are descended from the Medes. Now watch this. We have Arphaxad, the daughter or wife, and she marries this Kainam. In Kainam, it says, in the 13th Jubilee of the second week of the first year, therefore he took himself a wife. Her name was Melcha, the daughter of Madai. So he marries into the Medes, the son of Japheth. In the 4th year, he begot a son and called him Shelah. Okay? What do I think they're trying to do? I think they're trying to connect Canaan, Arphaxad, which is where the Babylonians come from, and Madai, which is where the Zoroastrians come from. I think they're trying to connect them all together with this Canaan guy. I think this is all made up, and it's really just Canaan, the son of Ham, who was taught by Ham to read the cuneiform, who revived all the mysteries. I think it's that simple. I think Canaan was taught by Ham to read the mysteries, and we see Ham was living near Canaan, downhill from Jerusalem. They called the land Ham. And then we see, we know we have Nephilim in the region. right while Ham is still alive. The Nephilim are living in the region. And then we know the Sinites and the Zemarites, which are also Canaanite tribes, go to Sumer and they start digging up that stuff. They also the Sinites seem to go to Egypt and help build the pyramids, or possibly rebuild the pyramids. And they become basically the pyramid builders of the world, and the Zemarites become the Mesoamerican pyramid builders. So it seems like these guys were in the business of digging up pre-flood stuff and knowing what they were looking at, because Ham was helping them understand it. And that's why Ham receives no blessing and Canaan receives a curse. That makes a lot more sense to me than this idea that he invaded land that never is mentioned in the Bible as him invading land. So if anyone has Exodus, these guys would get them to listen. I would say ask them to watch this video and say, hey, have you guys thought through these things? Have you considered these things? Have you looked at the Coffin text? Have you looked at the Ogdoad at Heliopolis, which is where Joseph was the priest, and how they have some 8 people who seem like Noah and his family? Because all this stuff's on Wikipedia. You don't have to be this arch scholar to figure out this stuff. The problem with these guys is I don't want to say these guys in general. I want to see scholars in general, is you can sometimes get siloed in by the so-called academic tradition. Just start with basic stuff like Wikipedia. And then if you need to dig deeper, then dig deeper. If you need to validate whether something is factual, validate something is factual. But if you start with guys like Doug, what is his name, Petrovich, and David Roll, I don't have anything against these guys except for some of their scholarship. I think they're doing awesome things for the body of Christ in terms of digging in and trying to connect the dots. They're doing the same stuff I'm doing, and I'm not saying I'm superior. I'm saying these guys have put in a lot of legwork and laid a foundation for what I'm trying to do, so I respect them for that, okay? But, they get stuck in these silos of information, and then they don't listen to each other because it's about who's publishing and who's publishing first, and whether or not your academics who are secular are going to find your ideas credible. And I've learned a lot of individual facts from these guys that are really awesome. But when you go to their overarching theories, they're not so awesome. Like both Doug Petrovich and David Roll, even though they don't like each other at all. I've read stuff they've written online. They don't like each other at all. These guys both believe that Nimrod is in Merkur. Both of these guys theorize that. Now, in Merkur, this is really dumb because in Merkur is his reign we have attested to 2750 BCE. Remember, Adam dies in roughly 3070 BCE. Okay, 3070 BCE. So you're seeing this 27 BCE. This guy reigns as a king 250 years later. Okay. It's when Adam dies, it seems like these NCs are set up all over Sumer. Okay, the NCs, and probably the what are they called? The gnomes in Egypt are probably first set up too. And these are the guys who are inheriting the rule of the cities from the patriarchs who founded those cities as they're dying. Okay. But and Merkur goes down in history as the guy who, Merkur and his wife, who knew how to build towns, made brick and brick pavements. When the yearly flood reached its proper level, they made irrigation channels and all kinds of irrigation ditches. What was he known for? A couple of things. He invents cuneiform. He also knows how to make brick towns and brick pavements. When the yearly flood reached its proper level, they made irrigation channels and all kinds of irrigation ditches. So what are these guys doing? They're mitigating floodwaters. Because these rivers are going to overflow seasonally because you're going to have the natural winter cycle and the floods are going to come down from the mountain peaks at certain times. Basically, the snows are going to pile up because it's a higher elevation, and then they're going to compress and form glacial ice, and then the glacial ice is going to start melting, and the ice is going to slide down, and the rivers are going to flood. This is how that happens all over the world. Well, and Merkur is good at ditch digging, and he's aware of these floods. And what is he doing? He's inventing a system. This is just so practical. You don't have to get all mysterious with this. He's inventing a system of keeping track of agricultural contracts using cuneiform, and they're baked brick, and they put them in towers that are sealed with bitumen so they can't get drowned out. Isn't that brilliant? It's a brilliant idea. That's why they talk about them making brick towns and brick pavements. Why? They're making baked brick. And these are going to be the first ziggurats. And the Tower of Babel is going to be a very huge one of these that they're going to build in the days of Hammurabi, and probably tell people it's going to be flood insurance in case God floods the earth again. There's a story that comes around called Enmerker and the Lords of Arata. And it talks about the Tower of Babel. It talks about the confusion of languages and how he goes to the Lords of Arata, which are basically the gods who descended from Ararat. They've deified Noah and his family, okay? And he's trying to get them to fix the languages again. This story was probably, these people date the story to 3250 BC. No. The Tower of Babel is not that far back. 3250 BC would be dating the Tower of Babel before Adam dies. Even if you use the Sumerian, it's still 200 years. It's still way too early. Well, no, it probably would with the LXX. It probably would work with that. But this 3250, notice he says he casts a spell on New-Dimid. Seems to be a version of Enki, the god of water, which makes Enlil reunite the languages. And they mention people. This is how I know this is written after the Tower of Babel. They literally met. Urartu is called, Ararat is called Urartu after the Tower of Babel. And the Amorites are just invading and taking over Sumer in the generation before the Tower of Babel. And so you have the story in Sumer, and it mentions the Amorites off to the west. And it mentions the lords of Urartu or Ararat, which are just north of Assyria. So, and then they mention Anana. You can always tell that you see the Akkad, Hamazi. I don't know what Hamazi is. Oh, Hamazi. That's Ham. That's probably their word for Egypt. Sumer, that's where the Zemrites are. Hamazi, that's Han. I don't know what Shuber is. Akkad and Martu, that's where the Amorites are. So they're literally taking all the great kingdoms of their area. I wonder if Hamazi is something else. Oh, they think Hamazi could be something up here. Hamazi. Kish was defeated and the kingship was taken to Hamazi. So that is a near city, okay? So the point is all the people that they're mentioning are near to their area. The lords of Urartu are up here. The Amorites are over here. Hamazi's right here. Sumer's right here. You see how it's just all local? If this guy's supposedly the king of the whole world, why aren't they mentioning the Egyptians? Why aren't they mentioning Elam? Why aren't they mentioning the wider world? And the answer is because it's a pretty local legend, and whoever's writing it only knows what's immediately north of them, basically. Immediately upriver. And it's probably post-Babel that they're writing it, because they're talking about a confusion of languages, so that's going to put you into probably the 16th century BCE. Much earlier than they're talking. So, moral of the story, again, just challenge people to look at this stuff. I want other people to do work and to contribute to the success of validating the Bible as true. But we got to pick a timeline. We got to pick the LXX or the Masoretic. And I would say going back into the 2nd and 3rd century BC and figuring out, that there were Hebrew texts that the LXX was based off, that doesn't matter. We know the Hebrews were changing the Bible. We know they're doing this. This is why they find a copy of the Bible in the days of Josiah, and they're like, we're not following any of this. How do they not know? This is in the days of Josiah, right before Jerusalem gets destroyed. They find a copy of the Bible, and they're like, we're not following any of this. How do they know that? Because they probably have corrupted Bibles. They have a priesthood going on, and they're doing stuff, but what are they following? Probably not the original Bible. They're probably changing it. And then I think there's a good motive to look at and say, well, what if they're trying to, again, these are secular Jews, and it's important. If you go to Jeremiah chapter, I think it's 34, the Jews who go into Egypt are cursed by God. No, I'm sorry. It's Jeremiah 43. After Jerusalem is destroyed, they go to Jeremiah and say, should we go into Egypt or should we stay here? And he says, stay here. And so they don't listen to him. They go to Egypt. They go and dwell in Taphnahes, and it tells you where all they dwell in chapter 40. They go to Migdol, Taphnahes, Noph, and Pathros. That's all over Egypt. They start out in Goshen, and then they're over by Thebes, and then they're over by Memphis. They're just going to the Egyptian cities to try to escape Pharaoh. And the ones who go to Tahpanhes are to try to escape Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is going to invade Tahpanhes, and that's how they're going to get to these other places. And by that time, they're praying to the Queen of Heaven. These are the Jews that go into Egypt, and these are going to be it's going to be their descendants, just about maybe a couple centuries later, that are there in Alexandria, Egypt. And so the idea that these people had the more faithful chronology, when they're worshiping the Queen of Heaven, they're mixing with the Egyptians. They're saying that Pythagoras got his stuff from them, which Pythagoras we know is mixing Babylonian and Egyptian mysteries together. I don't buy that. I think there can be individual translations of things in the Septuagint that are better, but the idea that the Septuagint is the translation of the faithful Jews and the Masoretic is the Jews who wanted to corrupt you away from believing in Christ as king, they did a miserable job, because they have Christ appearing right at the beginning of the days of Messiah. These guys, I don't know what they're following to say that because they're looking at Jewish stuff, and according to the dating of the Seder Olam, it's 3761 BC. I don't care what the Seder Olam says. I care what the Masoretic text says. The Masoretic text does not put it at 3761 BC. It puts it at 4004 to 4008 BC. That's where you can just do the math yourself. You just put together a spreadsheet, which I have. And again, this is me basically redoing Usher's work. And this with archaeology is within 50 years. With the archaeological stuff that we can track, it's within 50 years of it, okay? So the idea that everything in here matches the archaeology that we can track within 50 years, everything in it. Everything in it. And you guys are saying, yeah, but this can track the stuff that is based on, and I'm going to be completely frank with you, the so-called historical records that they're basing their stuff on. I've done my research, and I'm telling you, the primary authorities for all this is Manetho's Egyptica and the Sumerian King List. Those are the records they're going in. That's how they're getting their timelines. These are secular pagan histories that trace their people back to the gods, and they're saying those are the best timelines. Better than the Masoretic and archaeology agreeing. That's really bad, because you don't have anything outside of the Sumerian Kings List putting Sargon in 2300 BCE. That's when the flood happens. You don't have anything besides the Sumerian Kings List putting him there. Everything that claims to put him there is lists that come later that are based on the Sumerian Kings List, or they're lists that come from the same records as Manetho's come from. And that's for Egypt, okay? You take away those pagan histories out of your way, and these things were just pretty recent discoveries. I mean, Manetho's been around forever, but the Sumerian Kings List is, I think it was discovered in the 20th century. It might be the 19th century. You take away those things, and all of a sudden, Masoretic makes a lot of sense. And then you admit that these are propaganda by the Egyptians and the Sumerians who are trying to connect their royal lines back to before the flood seamlessly, and then just push the flood back in the background to make themselves look even more ancient. What they're trying to do is make themselves look more ancient than any other civilizations that have ever existed by connecting them to the pre-flood world. They're trying to make themselves look like the OG civilizations that everyone needs to respect, even though they're not. Babylon's been overthrown over and over and over again. Egypt's been overthrown by a flood, plus it's been gone through periods of chaos, plus the Jews. The Old Kingdom is basically the pre-flood world. The Middle Kingdom is basically the post-flood world to the time that the Jews get overthrown and put into slavery, and the New Kingdom is everything after the Jews get overthrown and put into slavery. It's that simple. That's Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. It was like, what happened? Everything just chaotically fell apart magically at the same day the Masoretic text says the flood is. What happened? Everything fell apart magically at the time when the Jews in triumphant Egypt are ruling everything, and then all of a sudden the Jews get overthrown and pushed into captivity, and Egypt starts going in decline after that. What's going on? Simple. The flood and the Jews. That's it. So you look at this stuff, and these are just the dates you get from the Masoretic text. And I get Christ at the year of our Lord, 0, Christ is born in 4 BCE. And that's 440 Artaxerxes' decree to bear the temple. And all this is doing is this just taking the king's list from the Kings and Chronicles, and I trace that all the way back to Solomon's temple. I go back from Solomon's temple 400 years to Moses, or 480 years to Moses, which is what it says in 1 Kings. And then I go back from Moses back through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what I don't do is add 400 years here. It's like 230 years, because it's 4 generations. That's what the Bible says. And then I go back to Adam, and I end up with 4008. So if the Masoretes were trying to tell you that Christ is too early for the days of Messiah or something like that, or too late for it, well, they butchered their own calculations because they didn't bother to read it and do the math, and realized that 3761 BC is not what the Masoretic text takes you to. There's no math you can do with the Masoretic text to end up with 3761 BC. I don't know how they get that. Maybe ChatGPT knows. (1656) to Adam. From the flood to Abraham, they have 292 years. That's pretty close to what I get. Abraham to the Exodus, they have 430 years. Here's why they get it wrong. Abraham to the Exodus isn't 430 years. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It is 430 years. I apologize. It is. It's actually from Abraham's promise to the giving the laws, 430 years. But pretty close. The Seder Olam puts the destruction of the first temple in 423 instead of 587, which the rest of the world puts it. Or 586 is what the world has it. So it has the destruction of the temple, and this is why the Seder Olam gets it wrong. They have their secular history wrong. See, the Seder Olam, what they're doing is, there's no archaeology to prove when Persia did this and Persia did that. So this is just the Jews going based on their oral tradition after the Bible's done. Okay? So where they lose 240 years is they put the destruction of the temple in 423 instead of 586. So there's 160 years right there, and then they compress the Persian period. And you see them doing this because this is why you're going to have second Esdras, or first and second Esdras actually represents that compressed period, because what they try to do is put Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah and all that stuff a lot closer together, when in fact there's like 80 years between them. So 160 years off by that, plus the 80 years off, there's your 240 years they're missing. So all the years that they get to 3761 BC, and they're saying, they're changing it so that the Messiah can't fit in their 3761 BC. Well, how did they do that? They magically changed it to, when we line up the history to the secular history, to exactly when the Messiah should come. Oops. Do you think they accidentally corrected everything to make Messiah line up at the right time by accident? I don't think they did that. So this is where the Jews get the idea that it's 5785 today. What they're saying in order to get to 5785 today is all histories are wrong except for ours. Because you're talking about the common histories where you start to have Herodotus and Tacitus and the Persian records, plus all the archaeology that came out after that's confirmed it. This is a well-attested period of archaeology. Okay, you have Babylonian archaeology, Assyrian archaeology, Egyptian archaeology, Greek histories, Persian royal records. You have so much stuff accounting these periods, and the Jews just jack it up. Do you know why? Because they're doing this in the days of the Greeks. And what they're doing is they don't know their Persian history. All they know is the Persian kings that are written in the Bible. And so what they're doing is they're cutting out the Persian kings that are between these kings, assuming that the Bible is accounting all the Persian kings that there are. And so they're like, oh, there's Darius and there's Artaxerxes, and they're making Darius the second, Darius the first, because they don't know there's multiple Darius, because they don't have access to the Persian king records. Those things just started getting discovered in the 20th century by archaeologists and putting these pieces together. And it turns out, oops, their records, which they thought they were going to mess up, Christ being the Messiah, and this is just what somebody says about them. This is not what they're saying. This is just what somebody says about them. This is a speculation of their motives. Turns out to make Christ align perfectly with the days of Messiah, if you get your history right between the temple periods. But they lose about 240 years of history between the temple periods. They don't know what they're doing historically. And it's really simple to do this. I get into this in my video where I'm showing where all the Apocrypha are wrong. And you find this truncated history. This is why they don't believe in Esther. They don't believe in Esther because Esther takes place during part of the period that they've screwed up and chopped out. So they think it's myth. Well, what they've done is they've taken Esther during Ahasuerus, and they think Ahasuerus, because it sounds like Artaxerxes, is Artaxerxes when it's actually Xerxes. And so you'll find Second Esdras calling Ahasuerus Artaxerxes when it's actually Xerxes. And Artaxerxes is his son, but you have other stuff that goes on when guys take over and overthrow and different stuff that goes on between that. And what you find is that you have Esther accounted in Persian history, but she's accounted as this girl that I think it was King Xerxes was supposed to. It was supposed to be his daughter's betrothed, and he ends up sleeping with her. That's what they say, and supposedly, Queen Vashti has her killed. Like they have the father killed by one of the sons, and then they have the son who's supposed to succeed him, who is actually married to Esther's daughter, killed, and then they have Esther killed. All this stuff happens probably within 10 years of the Esther story. So that's how it goes down for Esther. She ends up getting killed, and she saves the Jews, but she gets killed, her daughter gets killed, her husband gets killed, and that's how Artaxerxes takes the throne. And he's wicked. He's overthrown his brother, and probably helped kill his father. So you find this stuff again. You have to compare Esdras with Ezra, because they're two different records, and then you need to go look at Josephus's version of Ezra. This is why people are like, oh, Josephus was such a good scholar. No, he's not. He's just pulling stuff from the Jews' hearsay, and they don't realize, because nobody really has great records on the Persians before that. It's the only history they have of the Medes and the Persians comes from the Greeks, and the Greeks don't know it all. They don't have the official court records. The reason the Greeks have it is because they have Herodotus, who's reporting hearsay, and then they have this other Greek, and I forget his name, I think it's Xenophon, who actually is serving as a commander of Greek mercenaries who are working for the Persians. And so he is getting better hearsay, but it's still just hearsay. They don't have the official court records. And those official court records have now been largely discovered. And when you look at Persian history, and I'm going to get into a lot of this stuff in my Serpent by the Way book, because this Persian history justifies Esther as a real story. Get into this in another video. I'll talk about it again. But it's that information that fills in the gaps that the Jews lost, because they're mixing kings up. They're mixing up Darius I and Darius II and Ahasuerus and Xerxes and Artaxerxes. They're mixing them up. And they don't realize there's multiple Artaxerxes, there's multiple Xerxes, and there's multiple Dariuses. And so they're losing 240 years to come up with their jacked up calendar that they have now. So again, does that speak to a plot to get Messiah out of the way, or does that speak to just bad scholarship that ends up shooting them in the foot and putting Messiah right where... See, the Bible's right, their scholarship is bad. That doesn't sound like a plot to do something nefarious. That sounds like just bad scholarship. And usually you're not ending up with bad scholarship if you're trying to make a plot to hide something. They're just making mistakes because of their lack of historical knowledge. So Anyways, I hope all this makes sense to you guys. I would challenge you to watch this. If there's anything that any of you guys find in here that are like, hey, how would you answer this question here? Let me know, and I'll dig in on that. I would love to do that because in my Serpent by the Way book, taking the Masoretic chronology, I talk about that right in the introduction. Taking the Masoretic chronology and rejecting the LXX chronology is going to be kind of a foundation of what I'm doing. So if anyone says, hey, have you considered this during the LXX? I would love to hear those challenges from you guys because I want to make sure I'm doing my homework and ending up with the best scholarship. But I mean, I essentially write my introduction that lasts till about 30 pages or 22 pages. So I mean, I've got 20. The whole chronology of everything I'm going to be writing is based on the Masoretic text being the right one. So I'm going to be putting this stuff about the Chinese, the windstorm thing that comes through around the date of the Chinese flood, and how Shinar is China, and the mysterious mythological Chinese dynasties that have no archaeological evidence is because they're recording Shinar, not China. And then they move to China and they call it China or Shinar. Shinar is China. And the AR at the end of it is just Hurrian, which, remember, the people from who go with Abraham's dad to Haran become known as the Hurrian people. And they take all the gods from with them, and they go up there and they're worshiping Enlil and Inanna and stuff like that because they're from and that's where the name Hurrian comes from. But then their language after the Tower of Babel gets mixed up with these. The term Mitanni just means United Kingdom, but they're Japhethites up there, people of Urartu, and their language is basically a Japhethite language. It's like a Creole mixed of Semitic and Hamitic and Japhethite languages all mixed together, but it mostly becomes a Japhethite language, just like the Luwian language. Luwian becomes from Lud, which is a Semite, but the Luwian language, those are all Japhethite tribes up there. They're Thracians and Greeks and stuff like that, and so it ends up being a Proto-Indo-European language. So does Hittite, because after the Tower of Babel, they're mostly surrounded by people who are Japhethites. But the name of the people, Urian, is from Urian. And Haran, they probably think, even though Haran is with a CH, a guttural Haran, they probably think that Hurrian and Haran are related. And that's why it's kind of a capital there. But the Hurrian people are actually the people of They're worshiping Enlil and Inanna and stuff like that. So, again, these people are going to go Shinar to China, and that explains those dynasties. And all this stuff, I'm going to be pulling these threads together. And this is going to hopefully be a pretty succinct, 400-page book, like my Rightly Dividing book, but really tie ancient history together. And I want to listen to guys like these, because maybe I'm wrong on parts and maybe they're right, but at least I need to consider their arguments before I write. And so if you guys hear arguments that are like, hey, this could debunk what you're saying, have you worked through that argument and seen if that could be true, or you have an answer for that argument. So I would be super blessed if you guys would help with that, because again, this is 2 hours and 14 minutes long, and I'm going to keep looking at stuff like this and challenging it, but I would love other people to challenge me based on things that other people say like this, okay? So I hope you guys are blessed by this. Have a great Sunday. Have a great rest of your week. I'll try to do Chronicles in the next day or two, and you guys be blessed. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.